Hello, YouTube. It's me again, your humble host, Logan Albright, here to talk to you about another book that I read. And today I want to do something a little bit different. Today I want to talk about history, specifically the history of the kings and queens of Britain and a book I read on that subject. As some of you may know, I holidayed in Great Britain last September, and while I was over there, I enjoyed their great bookstores. They have Waterstones over there, which we don't really have anything comparable to in the United States anymore since all the good bookstores have died. And I really enjoyed shopping there, and I wanted to learn more about the country I was visiting, and I wanted to learn about the kings and queens of Britain because it was not something that I really knew anything about. So I browsed their selection, and I ultimately settled on this book, Gwynne's Kings and Queens, by N.M. Gwynne, A Indispensable History of England and Her Monarchs. By the pronoun her, possessive pronoun her in that sentence, you can probably tell that this is kind of an old-fashioned book, although it was released in 2018, so it's really not that old of a book. But the author is certainly an old curmudgeon-y guy. Now, before I get too far into this, as you can tell by the title, I'm going to kind of tear this book apart a little bit, but I don't want you to think that I don't like it, because I actually found this book tremendously enjoyable, and I learned a lot from it, and I found it really funny in parts. But part of what I found funny about it was just how unashamed the author was in kind of flouting the traditional conventions of what we consider to be a good history book. And I think some of his opinions are ridiculous, but I enjoyed reading his book because it made it more memorable in a sense, to instead of just a dry listing of facts. Like the fact that the author has all these ridiculous opinions sprinkled throughout made it a little bit more fun and a little bit more memorable. So I don't want you to be too hard on Mr. N.M. Gwynne, because I really did enjoy his book and I learned a lot from it. However, that being said, N.M. Gwynne is probably someone who should not really be writing history books for the public, because he has no shred of objectivity in his writing. He makes no pretense at objectivity. He has a point of view, and he is going to tell you what that point of view is. And in a way, that's sort of refreshing, because everybody has a bias. Nobody is really as objective as they like to believe they are. So seeing someone who wears their bias on their sleeve is a lot of fun, and it takes some pressure off you, the reader, to try to figure out like where the author is coming from, because you know where the author is coming from. He tells you. And where he's coming from is he is a staunch monarchist, and he is a very old-fashioned type of English schoolmasterly type. He has very low opinion of children, and he has a very low opinion of the modern world in general. He has a very low opinion of democracy, and he has a very low opinion of the United States of America. And he's not shy about that. He also is a super contrarian who is angry at the way that history has been taught in the past, and is setting out to correct the record as he sees it and contradict a lot of what has previously been said. So where to begin? In the preface of the book, he talks about his philosophy of the education of history, which is like where I knew we were in for something special in this book, because he's very angry that people want to teach children things that they're interested in. He says that's bad. We should not teach children things that they're interested in. That's just a stupid way to run your society. It doesn't matter whether children are interested in things. They have to be taught things that we want them to know and that we think are important. And he actually says they should be taught history before they're old enough to understand it. Just like drill it into them, which I think is just such a silly idea. Like, what good is that going to do? But he is so convinced that memorizing this list of dates and names is going to improve society in some way, that he thinks we need to do this to kids and ignore whether they're having fun or interested. He doesn't seem to think that you learn better when you're interested in something, or you are more engaged with the material when it's something you're interested in. He's like, doesn't matter, just drill it into them. He talks a lot about learning by heart, which he distinguishes, to his credit, from learning by rote. He says learning by rote is the wrong way to think about it. It's learning by heart, and that it becomes a part of you. But really what he's talking about is memorization. And the very first thing in the book is he provides a list of all the kings with the dates, which is a useful reference, and you're going through and looking at things, looking at the kings and queens and the dates in which they ruled and the dates in which they lived. Fine, that's great to have. But he says the first thing you should teach children is to memorize that table. And like, what? That's not how you're going to learn history. You're not going to learn anything useful by just memorizing a table. You need to put these things into context and understand what the broader outline of the story is, and why it's important and why it matters. And that's how you learn these things. You don't just memorize names and dates. That's a crazy way of trying. I mean, I guess it's a way a lot of people learned for a lot of time in the school system, but I've always thought it's completely backwards, because who's going to be able to remember that? And it doesn't mean anything to you. It's just a random list. So that's my kind of initial beef with him, is his way of uh, his philosophy of thinking of how children should learn history. Is basically just memorize, memorize, memorize. It doesn't matter whether you are interested in it. It doesn't matter whether you can understand it even. Just memorize it because you have to know it. And so I come from an educational background where I was homeschooled my entire life. In fact, I was unschooled. I was allowed to pursue my own interests, and I learned really well because the things I was learning were things that I wanted to learn. I wasn't just told you have to learn these things because. And so I learned really well, and I ultimately became interested in most things and wanted to learn about them. And I think that's a great way to pursue knowledge. But N.M. Gwynne says, no, don't do that, just memorize. So, okay, that's where we start off with the book. And then he gets into the history. And the history is really interesting. I really like it. I learned a lot about these kings and queens and the prehistory of Britain. It goes all the way back to the beginning. It comes forward. But he's got a real political axe to grind throughout, where he doesn't like the way that certain monarchs have been portrayed by history, and he's going to correct the record. And it seems like he's just like willfully contrarian on a lot of these things. And I mean, I don't have enough of an independent historical background to know really who's in the right on these questions. Because, for example, he loves Richard III, and he hates Queen Elizabeth I, and he loves King John. And, he hates a lot of people that history traditionally loves, and he loves a lot of people that traditionally history hates. And he says that all the other historians are wrong and he's right, and he gives some evidence for his claims. He doesn't just claim this, but again, like without reading, a dozen more history books like this, I don't have enough context to know if he's right in his assessment of these things or not. But I am amused by how violently he just says, no, these other people are wrong. Here's the truth. I'm telling you, Queen Elizabeth gets too good of a rap. She was actually a tyrant and a monster. Richard III gets a bad rap because of Shakespeare, and he was actually a wonderful king. And he doesn't try to couch that in any kind of moderation. He's just like, this is the way things are, I'm telling you. And I think that's a really kind of interestingly opinionated way to approach the teaching of history. He really has an axe to grind. And then, even better than that, is when he gets into his defense of monarchy, because he really loves monarchy and he really hates democracy. And he goes on and on about how democracy is an insane system, allowing just random people who don't know anything to pick the leaders is a stupid way of doing business, and that monarchy is better because you raise a child from birth to be responsible for their country and to have some kind of internal stake in doing a good job as the monarch, and that they will do better for their own legacy and for the legacy of their children, and that's great. And it sounds kind of good on paper. Like, he makes a pretty persuasive argument from a kind of reasonable rationalist perspective, if it weren't for the fact that we have thousands of years of history of horrible monarchs doing tyrannical, evil things. I mean, he may have a point about democracy too. I'm not sure democracy is all that much better, but to say monarchy is definitively better, I think there's a lot of evidence to the contrary in terms of terrible monarchs throughout history. So I wasn't really sold on that, but he's just so enthusiastic about it. And he goes on these tirades about what a ridiculous country the United States is, and how the Constitution is an absurd document, and just no sympathy or respect at all for anyone who disagrees with him on the question of monarchy. And he also has this thing about the monarch necessarily being above the law. He says the monarch is the fount of law, from which all law flows, and that it doesn't make any sense to have the monarch be above the law. It doesn't make any sense to have the monarch be subject to the law. The monarch must necessarily be above the law. And so he's very critical of, for example, the Magna Carta, which most people recognize as a pretty important legal document in the history of human rights, of kind of holding tyrants accountable. And he's like, that's awful. The tyrants should never be held accountable. They should be able to do whatever they want because they're the fount from which all law flows. And to hold them accountable is to diminish their sovereignty as monarchs. And really old-fashioned opinions like that he holds very strongly and is very emphatic about. And I found that really amusing. But I think it's a weird way to teach history, isn't it? It's a strange way, is to be so opinionated and to just dictate, this is the way things ought to be and this is the way things are, instead of taking a more balanced approach and letting the reader kind of make their own mind up about some of these things. He's also clearly quite nationalist on his preference for British things and disdain for international influences, which is fair enough, I suppose. But yeah, I titled this How Not to History because I think that it's a kind of an absurd way to try to present history to someone, especially if you're presenting it to a less sophisticated reader, maybe a younger reader who hasn't had more experience reading about this stuff, to just present this stuff as fact and to be so opinionated in your presentation. I don't think it's a good way to teach history, although like I said, I don't want to be too hard on the book because I actually really thought it was a lot of fun. But part of what I thought was fun about it was kind of laughing at the author's, foaming at the mouth in his recounting of this history. But I did learn a lot of it. It's a very thorough history. It goes right up through Queen Elizabeth and Prince Charles and what's going on right now, since it was only published a few years ago. So, if you are looking for a nice overview of all the different monarchs that Britain has had over the years, and a handy reference that you can refer to them and kind of memorize them, figure out the general outline of the British history and how it went, this is a great book, a great research for that, as long as you don't make the mistake of trying to, confuse it with some kind of an objective accounting. And, I also have a sympathy for revisionist history to a certain degree. I like when people challenge the official narrative and say, well, maybe it isn't the way that everyone said. Maybe Richard III wasn't so bad. Maybe the Magna Carta wasn't so good. Let's consider those ideas. I think that's important to do. So I like it in that respect, but I would certainly recommend kind of pairing it with another more traditional history book so you get both sides of that. But I just wanted to talk about that today because I thought it was such an interesting read, and I don't often encounter nonfiction books that kind of amuse me and make me think to that degree. And so I wanted to bring up Gwynne's Kings and Queens. And if you guys are interested in British history, that might be an interesting resource for you to pick up. I don't even know if it's available in the United States now that I think about it, because I only bought it in England. Maybe you can't even get it here, in which case this is probably a wasted review. But I hope that you have gotten some enjoyment out of it anyway. I wanted to provide you with some video because I know it's been a couple weeks since I've been able to upload anything. So hopefully this has been enjoyable for you, and I'll be back just as soon as I can with some more book reviews because I'm diligently plowing my way through my reading list, and I want to get some more fictional book reviews up for you pretty soon. So thanks so much for watching. I've been your host, Logan Albright, and I'll catch you next time.